You are tuned in to WVEW LP Brattleboro, 107.7 FM. This is your community radio station. Or there's also a chance you're tuning into BCTV, Comcast channels 1078, 1079. But either way, we're glad you're here. So this is usually a radio show called Wow and Flutter. My name is Johnny, and I host a show on WVEW every Sunday at 6 p.m. Today we're doing something a little different, though. I'm really pleased to be joined in the studio right now by an advocate for the Women's Freedom Center, Shari. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Glad you're here. So this year, your organization is celebrating 50 years of being active in the community in Windham and Windsor counties, and I think that's awesome. For anyone who might not know, they are the local organization working to end domestic and sexual violence in Windham and southern Windsor counties. They're a feminist organization committed to offering support and advocacy to all survivors of violence, as well as prevention and educational activities to help create a community in which violence is not tolerated. They have 24-hour hotlines. Windham County's number is 802-254-6954, and Southern Windsor County's number is 802-885-2050. And again, those are 24-hour hotlines. They're confidential. They can be called 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There's also a toll-free number. So make sure you get your pen and paper out. 1-800-773-0689 is their toll-free number. They accept collect calls. I'm in my mid-20s. I'm not even sure I know what a collect call is at this point.
You can see that language has been on the website for a little bit of time, right?
Yeah,
absolutely.
Right? But after 4 p.m. on weekdays and all hours on weekends, their crisis calls go directly to their answering service. Their calls are passed on to an advocate who will return them right away. They have language line services if an interpreter is needed, and use Vermont Relay for deaf and or hard of hearing survivors. So that's all the logistical information. I guess I also didn't mention the website, which I believe is womensfreedomcenter.net.
You got it.
Straight up. Okay, great. It's a great website.
Thank you.
So we got all the logistical information kind of out there.
Yes, we did.
I want to kind of get to know you, and I want to get to know the organization a little bit better. I guess a good place to start might be sort of the history of the organization, because it's been 50 years. I'm sure a lot has changed in 50 years. I'm curious as to how it came to be and maybe how it's evolved sort of since that inception in the 70s.
Yeah, fantastic question. And again, thank you so much. I appreciate you giving the snapshot overview of the work of the Freedom Center. So one of the places, that we pause is what word even we use for marking this 50th anniversary, right? Because there are absolutely things that we know have gotten so much better in our culture. But for us, if we were an individual or an organization, it's more celebration turning 50. For us, it's more a commemoration, right? Because we still are a crisis organization. We're still a social change, social justice organization. We honor and celebrate the resilience and the inspiration and activism of survivors and our foremothers, for the most part, that helped get us going. But we would love to go out of business because there's no more hotlines ringing, right? Yep. So there's a lot to celebrate, and then we also use the word commemorate, and that's kind of the mix, and I think that gives an overview. And to go back to sort of your original question, I think it's always poignant to have this conversation with media, because initially it's a good reminder that in the late 60s and early 70s, when some of the conversational roots began, that then became what was called the Women's Community Center and then a Rape Crisis Center, all of that was still revolutionary at that time, because before that, here we are on media, which is fantastic, and we're grateful for that. But those early activists still had to overcome a pretty vast historic silence. Like countless generations before, people didn't feel able to even acknowledge that anything like this was happening to them, whether domestic or sexual violence. And going back to sort of your intro as well, we always underscore that we still have women in our name, but we support survivors of all genders who've experienced domestic or sexual violence or sex trafficking. And so, we always want to put that out there. But so already we can say there's a snapshot of how far we've come, right? Our original name for 35 years, I think it was, had the word crisis in there because that was the cultural education, just to have people realize that this is not a personal thing only happening behind closed doors. It's across the culture. It's a societal problem. So in those days, crisis was the momentous word there, to have people really tune in. But that's how it began. That sort of first struggle was from the homes into the streets, and then from vigils into the news. And so again, it's always poignant for us to now have these conversations readily on media, but that took a lot of inspiration. And so getting back to the original question, the Freedom Center, like many of the almost 2,000 programs around the country and just the US alone, began as a local Me Too movement. There were a number of sexual assaults being reported right here in Brattleboro, and that amazing set of activists came together to talk about what do we do about that. And of course, it was all braided into just a very revolutionary time in terms of civil rights conversations across the board in our culture at that time. And the same held true for feminism, And so that was the good reminder that there was no template for this kind of work. That early group of mostly women, but not all women, came together and they kind of taught themselves how to do the work, answer a phone. And when they started answering the phone themselves, what they thought would be a rape crisis center, they quickly realized it was mostly people calling because their partner was harming them. And that's when they quickly, again, taught themselves how to form a broader organization. And then Women's Crisis Center was formed, and that was in 1974.
It seems like, it started as maybe a support network of just folks who were sort of going through the same thing, but sort of redirecting their energy toward helping others, creating systemic change even. And I also, am noticing this change in the way that the organization is framed. You mentioned it was originated sort of crisis in the name, and now you're called the Women's Freedom Center. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, if that sort of changed the scope of what the mission of the organization is, rather than focusing on a problem as opposed to focusing on overall liberation.
Yeah, it's a fantastic and foundational question for us. And there was a lot of conversation even before I worked there about pivoting to change the name. But I think, again, because of the fabulous foundation of foremothers, advocates over the years, have recognized language has power. And so initially, crisis was the word to galvanize people to help. But then after 35 years or so, the culture kind of got acclimated to this notion, maybe there's always going to be a crisis center. And we're here to say, absolutely not, right? Like, absolutely. So the work has always been towards freedom and liberation for everyone. But at some point, we realize we need to wake that language back up again, right? And so, what's missing for survivors of all genders isn't just the absence of crisis, it's the true freedom, right? What would that look like? And I would say that's probably the most rewarding part of our job, is to sit with people who are reclaiming their lives again with a sense of joy and promise. And sometimes, they've never had access to that for all kinds of reasons, or sometimes they haven't for the length of time they've been in a relationship. And so, we get to witness that transformation. And initially, not everybody was on board with us changing the name from Crisis to Freedom back then. And we're sort of wondering and concerned, maybe rightfully, that, how will survivors find you if that's not how you're listed? And we trust in the resilience of survivors figuring it out. And we had so much wonderful feedback from people feeling like, actually it feels different to call, because people beforehand might even be apologetic or feel like, I don't know if this crisis is, quote, bad enough.
Yeah,
I don't want to take up your
burdening.
Yes,
you.
If I'm taking up your hotline time. But now it's like, hell yeah, if I can say that. People just feeling like, I am aiming towards freedom, right? There's something righteous and healing about just realizing, this is the key here. This conversation is part of my healing journey, potentially, and we welcome that. So that name has felt energizing, and it zooms out as far as we can, like what is still missing in the culture and what's our ultimate goal. And it's, like I said, those hotlines going quiet in some generation, we may not live to see it, but at some point we're working towards that for sure.
Yeah, and I feel like that's just more invigorating for the folks that you're working with, for them to get in the mindset of, obtaining freedom rather than dealing with a crisis.
Yeah,
I think
exactly.
That's great.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All of us, I would say, probably as humans, none of us wants to be identified with some awful thing that's happened to us. And freedom is something, we can embrace. Everybody in their own way has some version of a freedom story or a healing story or things they themselves have overcome. And that can just add some momentum, to their process.
Yeah. Let's look at things maybe a little more granularly.
Sure.
I'm curious as to what circumstances would someone want to consider calling the Women's Freedom Center? I'm sure, there are some examples you give me that might seem like obvious examples.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm sure there are also opportunities where you might encourage someone to call the center who might not consider that, they might not feel like, they have a crisis, or they might not feel like, their problem is warranted with a call. So in what instances might someone want to reach out?
Love that question because it is so welcoming. And my gut instinct there would be to say that if it even crosses their radar, that it might be worth a conversation. We want to demystify calling either a hotline, or we do have a business line if somebody is on the fence. But again, we support survivors of all genders who've experienced domestic or sexual violence or sex trafficking. So anywhere on that spectrum, the few things to know about our hotline, and I would say most hotlines, is people absolutely can call anonymously. They do not have to give us their real name if they don't want to. But that's the reason we're 24/7, and that's the reason that around the clock, they will get a very quick response from a full-time paid staff person as an advocate that can hear out like what's going on for them in that moment. And, if, again, depending on what's going on anywhere on the spectrum, whether somebody has an imminent safety need, they can call. But even, and this happens quite frequently, where somebody wants or would welcome a little bit of feedback. You know what? I've just started dating this person, and I'm just kind of getting, I don't know, is this a red flag? Am I overreacting?
Yeah.
Or, right? Especially in our culture, and especially depending on the age, we sometimes, aside from the fact that it's confidential, we have no agenda for the caller at all, except to be available to them, to offer a listening ear, some support, answer questions that they might have, and they steer the conversation. We trust folks to be the experts on their own lives, and they may or may not know what options are out there. But let's say somebody calls and says, I don't know, is this normal? Like, this is my first serious partner, and they're constantly checking up on me, and I have to give them my passwords. And if that's somebody's first relationship, and, they're being told, oh, this is love, I just miss you. And, so we sometimes will get, and I know that's sounds like a very early, developmental kind of question in terms of somebody learning what is or isn't healthy, but that's a call they could make, right? Or we also welcome calls. Here's another one, and this wasn't always as well known, and so we appreciate a chance to have these conversations. We don't want to just be a support for survivors or people that are going through something themselves. We also can take calls from concerned friends or family members or neighbors or engaged bystanders. Again, it can be hypothetical. They don't have to say who the person is, but just they may ask us, what's the safest, most discreet way I could get a little bit of information to the survivor and not make them feel on the spot or nervous that I'm, and we have a column occasionally that appears in the different area newspapers, and we had one right when the lockdown began happening, inviting folks to call in if they were, because they were now, locked in at home and hearing more of the day-to-day lives of their neighbors than they did when everybody was off at work. And we started getting people asking, some of these questions, but we welcome that. And from other community organizations that maybe are hypothetically saying, hey, you know what, I've got this coworker or this client that I'm working with, I'm a therapist. Can you just brainstorm with me a couple of the different ways that I can help this person? And one of those is always to let the person, the survivor, know that they can reach out to us confidentially. So I'm going to pause there and let you jump back in.
Yeah. No, I think speaking to speaking to what you were saying about some of the other calls you're getting that aren't just objectively, crises, I think that's a great way to, do more preventative work rather than, sort of damage control, or rather than saying like, okay, we're going to offer you a place to stay, or, giving them sort of a well-rounded perspective and, advice.
Yep.
And I think that's great. I honestly, having written the question, never even thought of that as the potential answer.
But it was a great question because I think, not everybody is familiar. And if it hasn't crossed their path in their lives, they may not, maybe haven't thought that through. But we absolutely, one of the things I'll say that is super heartening over these 50 years, and obviously I haven't been there that long either, but in terms of the movement itself, is that there are now so many more supports for survivors in our country and, even around the world. And part of that is the effect of this kind of education, solidarity movements. I would say not even every generation, but every few years, we have more informed folks calling us that want to be helpful and want to support the survivor. And so in survivors' own lives, their friends, family, coworkers, landlords, maybe the ones in a very good-hearted way wanting to get some information to them. So we know that it's way more the people in the survivor's life already that can be part of the safety network. And that's the best safety net any of us can ever have in this world, is if we live in a community where people are on each other's radar and offer a little bit of help, or just check in and say, hey, you know what, not prying at all if you don't want to share, but I'm here if you ever need to talk, and I'm just a little concerned about you. Let me know if I can ever be helpful. Anything like that. We can never necessarily know what kind of lifeline that can be for somebody. And they may not take us up on that offer in the beginning, but they tuck it away, right? And in that moment, they might remember, you know what, actually that coworker, I think I will confide in them because they once reached out to me, and that can be completely life-changing,
Yeah, just planting those seeds, I think is super important, because you never know when you might need it in your own. You might feel like you'll never need it, and then, there you are feeling helpless.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one other, statistic, and again, we know that abuse can happen to any one of us as a human. But the flip side is also true. Every single human can be an ally to another person in trouble. But just one of the many statistics out there is that 1 in 3 women will experience domestic or sexual violence at some point in their lives. So no matter where we go, no matter what workplace we have or audience we're sitting in, there are survivors listening to how we respond to some of these topics.
Yeah, and it's, in terms of how and when that can occur, it's totally non-discriminatory. So
exactly. Absolutely.
You really just, you can't ever know, you can never nail it down to, well, hey, don't go here, or don't, take this job.
Exactly.
You can never really nail that down.
Absolutely true. Yeah.
So how can folks reach you who maybe are like under duress, maybe they're uncomfortable making a phone call to you? You sort of mentioned concerned family members or friends might reach out, but if someone really doesn't have that network, are there ways that they could reach out sort of safely?
Yeah, I mean, ideally, the person is wanting to reach out. And so a couple of the different buffers we have in place is, again, they don't have to give us their real name. There's zero agenda at all, except to listen and see what they would want to talk about. So they could make the call without revealing anything and just ask a couple of questions. This also began during the pandemic, but we still have it during kind of business hours, 8 to 4 during the work week. People can do web chat. What I will add to that is that when concerned third parties call, on someone's behalf, we consider that a completely confidential hotline call. So let's say a mom calls and her adult daughter is going through something. We wouldn't confirm or deny to the mom that maybe we're already working with the daughter. If the daughter later calls, we would not confirm or deny that we've ever heard. Everybody gets that completely confidential call. We're never crisscrossing people's information. So that can help people reach out because they're maybe concerned, where's this going to go, this information? So hopefully that has people, again, as we mentioned before, just demystify. Any one of us might need a hotline at some point. It's the same with counseling, right? Zero shame. It's actually a sign of strength and some self-care to just reach out and have a conversation. And if that conversation doesn't, answer what they're needing, we hopefully can give them some additional, if we're not the resource for what's going on. Because again, we don't support survivors of every kind of violence, but we absolutely have some phone numbers and we can let them know what else might be available if we're not the right resource for them. So making that phone call, hopefully they get a really warm and welcoming response, and we just take it one step at a time, I would say.
And I don't want to totally put you on the spot here, but like, what are some other networks that you might, have information for, or that, you might have a relationship with the Women's Freedom Center that you might often be referring people towards if their call doesn't necessarily fit into, your services? Yeah,
I mean, it's a great question, because any and every kind of situation at some point crosses a hotline, right? Just because we are 24/7 and folks are struggling. And so we do, have phone numbers at the ready. For instance, if folks are struggling with homelessness, right? If it's not connected to recently fleeing a domestic violence situation, we certainly can give them the various numbers for resources for being homeless in this community. Once in a while, it may be our work, it may be domestic violence, but the survivor maybe no longer feels safe in this community. So we absolutely can connect them and help them actually get to another county or possibly another state if they need to, for safety's sake, get away. We work with all the other independent programs around the country as needed. We as advocates, here's another one that comes up fairly often. So we're not clinically trained as therapists, and we don't assume that somebody wants or needs that, but sometimes they do, right? Or in addition, they may want to put a little constellation of supports together by talking with an advocate, maybe coming to our support group and meeting some peers kind of in a similar situation, and a therapist. So we have a list of therapists that have been vetted by other survivors. And so it can be that whole constellation that we just kind of wait to hear. And, I would say across the spectrum of the hotline calls we get, some folks, there is an imminent danger. And so we would be really immediately looking to how to help them get even to maybe a safer phone than the phone they're on. Then that, we can talk about that. But it would be the safety of that person sort of imminently. And those are kind of quicker, more urgent calls. And sometimes people are calling and it's been 10 years since an assault happened, and now they're finding that it's hard to trust in dating again. And so there's not an urgent safety need, but they really need a warm human at the other end of the line to bear witness to what is going on for them. And then, of course, everything in between those two ends of the spectrum.
Yeah. And I think, this sort of lends itself to my next question, which is looking at things even more granularly than we have been. And just sort of, the role that you play in each individual case. If someone is calling you with, they're in imminent danger, they need help, like sort of what that looks like. And you sort of alluded to a couple of those concepts, and I'm sure it also varies widely. But maybe, some examples of what kind of action you folks take might be enlightening for anyone who might not know or that they need these things.
Absolutely. So one thing I can sort of add here is that in recent years, we weren't always asking this, but one of the first questions we now ask when someone calls the hotline is whether they've had any safety concerns about the phone they're using, right? Especially now with technology being everywhere, and the potential for hacking technology being way more prevalent. That's our first question, right? Is the call even safe? Because if somebody is doing this research about their options and they're basically leaking all that to the person trying to keep them stuck, the person threatening to harm them or worse, we don't want to be leaking that information to the person. So probably I would say the most critical support we offer, and you mentioned a bunch at the sort of top of the hour, the shelter, the hotline, all kinds of other resources, but individual safety planning, up to the minute safety planning is the best resource that we've got. And again, it's full-time paid trained staff. And so if that's the first question and the person says, actually, you know what, I have been wondering because X, Y, and Z has happened and it doesn't make sense. How would my partner know these things? So text stalking may, it's not to scare anyone, that might not be happening, but sometimes people have a hunch that some unusual things have happened that are inexplicable unless the tech has been hacked. And it could be their laptop, it could be any number of things. So to get back to your question, the first thing we may help somebody strategize is whether it's possible, and if so, how to just get to a safer phone. And so it may be as granular as, is there a possibility to get to someplace safer? Even help them if they feel like, it's not that I'm not sure about the conversation, but maybe it's the location tracking on this phone. We may literally pull the strands apart to figure out, is there a safe way that they can get themselves to another location or borrow a phone? Or would it be safer to wait maybe till they go to work the next day and leave that phone, it depends what's even safe to say on the first phone call.
Right.
But those are the kinds of things. Sometimes, we never assume that somebody is ready to just leave their relationship at all, right? Or their partner at all. So safety planning for one person might look like, okay, this person best. If they come home from work and they've had a few drinks and they slam the door and you can feel the pressure and the water rising, what are some safe ways that, what has already worked for you? So safety planning with one person might look like, what's the safest way to just get through the night? And obviously, if anybody is in imminent danger, the fastest way to get some help to arrive, because we're not able to go to somebody's location or be their ride, but potentially friend or family member, and there can be like even an alibi or a code word. We safety plan with people. What are some ways if they don't want to involve law enforcement, or what is a safe way that you could have to run such and such errand and be right back, and that's what you use, or law enforcement if that's needed, right? And another, so for one person, it might be getting safely through the night. For another, it might be, what's my safest way out of here for my kids and I to get out of Vermont, right? And so anywhere along that spectrum, the call may come in and we just take it from there.
Yeah, and so then I'm curious as to what the line is between, your goal to provide services to folks and to maybe empower people to sort of, take things by the reins. Obviously, people aren't always able to do that in every circumstance.
Yeah.
But I'm curious as to what that balance looks like for you. Like, where do you try to start? And obviously, you're going to be met with totally different circumstances every time. But then, where do you start? And then how do you sort of guide that line between empowerment and sort of providing services?
It's such a great nuanced question. And I would say, anytime we have these conversations, we always start with validating the strengths people already have, right? So even when we use words like, for instance, we have a bystander empowerment workshop to help end sexual harassment, just as an example. Anytime we use the word empowerment, we're really highlighting the power people already have. And the fact that anybody has already managed to survive thus far, whatever's been going on for them, and reach out and call for help, that's enormous, right? We build on the strengths that the person already has. They may or may not realize that. They may have had their self-esteem so crushed by this situation that they're questioning themselves. It's not uncommon. So we start with, again, validating what they've already done thus far. And sometimes it's mostly a matter of knowing that there are other options. People may not realize, we shelter survivors of all genders if they're fleeing an unsafe partner situation. And that may be all that they need. From there, they got it. From there, they can keep their job if they're safe in the community. Maybe we help them get a civil protective order so that their ex can't stalk them and harass them at work and try to sabotage but maybe the only, in quotes, thing they needed was a safe place to be for them and their kids, to just be able to break up and have that take hold rather than the person just 2 a.m. banging on the door and coming back kind of thing. So it's mostly, us kind of getting on board with what somebody already would like to have happen and has already tried, and then letting them know what the options are that are out there for them.
Like you're really like adapting to their energy,
Exactly.
to what they're already sort of thinking, what their skills are, what they're expressing to you.
Yeah.
You're just like letting them guide it.
Absolutely. Yeah. We meet them where they are. And that's why, as I mentioned, safety planning for one person maybe has nothing to do with them leaving. I love this person. We've got kids. I'm not leaving, but what are some of my options when my partner comes home and is, doing X, Y, or Z? That may be exactly where they want that conversation to stay. We're not bumping it anywhere else, right? It just as you said, we're letting them kind of guide it based on what they're saying next.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
And do you ever do you try to keep some of these conversations, meetings, and things like really separated, or do you ever meet with people like in person?
Oh, all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. So yeah, I mean, that's, so we have a number of confidentially located shelters, as well as a confidentially located office. And, it's up to the individual survivor, right? But anyone that we speak with on the hotline, if they are wanting or needing to meet in person, especially to maybe do paperwork if they want, or do a protective order, or any number of things, we meet with many, many survivors in person, I would say. So it's not strictly a phone kind of situation. Some people maybe don't want to meet in person, so there's no obligation at all. But absolutely, we welcome that. We do have a couple of different completely drop-in support groups that meet every Friday. So we have one that's for all self-identified women. And then we have one that's for all gender identities, including self-identified women. And so that, can meet in person. We can also do that virtually. So there's kind of the whole spectrum, depending on what somebody wants.
Yeah. Again, you're just like really providing sort of just like a safety net for people to express, their needs. And then I think that's just great. So you alluded to this a little bit with one of the support groups, but how do you serve clients that aren't necessarily women? I'm sure that, that's how the organization started. I'm sure a lot of your clients are women. But I'm curious, what these cases look like, if they're different, if you ever feel like people who aren't women maybe have a hard time reaching out, or I'm wondering if you can just speak to this.
Always appreciate that question. And one of the things I would say, as and we respect all, different realms where people are doing amazing work, including, let's say, social work or organizations that refer to the folks that they're helping as clients. The Freedom Center has stayed pretty true to sort of our grassroots language. And so we refer to folks in whatever way they choose. And so if it's women, we refer to them strictly as women, the women that we're working with. And we also, we let folks self-identify. So across the gender spectrum, if somebody reaches out to us, we absolutely respect their pronouns, their life experience. We are open and welcoming to learn from them. We know we don't have it all figured out. And I would say absolutely there can be barriers for any survivor to even reach out and admit it's happening to them. And in our culture, it can be that much more challenging for folks that maybe are already feeling marginalized in one way or another. It can also be challenging for sure for cisgendered straight men to give a call to the hotline if, let's say, their female partner is harming them. So we, and this is like part of sort of our longer term work, this unpacking this legacy of gender that we've all inherited, right? Patriarchy isn't ultimately kind to anybody. It just plays out differently. And so we really want to honor every single survivor's healing journey that often happens quietly and visibly, and others don't necessarily know everything somebody's been through. But so to answer the original kind of question here, we support survivors of all genders in the same way. We may not shelter them in the same building, but we provide shelter if somebody is fleeing an unsafe partnership. We meet with people in person across the gender spectrum. We can help them access whatever the resources are out there. And we try to, sort of adapt to what people are presenting to us and make it work for them in the best way that we can.
Yeah, I liked what you were saying about sort of some of the work that you're doing to break down this, inherited idea of, gender and the restrictions that come along with that. And I'm curious, what kind of work you're doing along those lines, whether it's sort of subtle in terms of just like allowing calls from anyone and asking them, how they identify, or if there's like any proactive work you're doing to sort of break down some of these gender barriers that might exist.
Yeah, again, another spot on fabulous question. So as folks may know, we, while we still, even though we changed our name to Freedom Center, we still, of course, are a crisis center. So a good portion of our days and our weeks is responding directly to individuals experiencing crisis. But we see ourselves as a social change organization. So a huge part of our work, side by side, is community outreach and education, including conversations like this, right? And educational workshops. They can be wellness themed, like healthy relationship workshops. They can be bystander empowerment workshops. To get to your question, we've had and are still open to, for any organization or individuals that are interested, unpacking the gender box film and discussion nights that we had in libraries all around Windham and southern Windsor County a few years back, where we look at this inherited legacy of gender, right? And how it's why we have the culture we have, right? And recognizing that, for instance, what boys and men are put through in terms of stereotypical gender socialization is incredibly traumatic. And that too is part of why we have the culture we have, right? And of course, women and girls, and certainly folks, non-binary folks that identify in any other way, and all the other ways humans are, right from the start. I mean, the fact that I always find the term gender bias redundant, actually, because if you think about it, gender is a bias, right? If we're told right from the start that there's only two ways you can kind of be, right from the start, we're trying to cultivate something. If it were natural, we wouldn't have to tell anybody anything, but it's completely unnatural and I would say unnecessary, right? And the more we help liberate, getting back to that word freedom, all humans to be who they are and have the right to be authentic, healing happens there. And, the solidarity and the allyship that can happen when folks are not sort of oppressed right from day one, right? To be allies with each other and let everyone, access their birthright to be authentic. I mean, that's where change. I think that's someday, right, when the hotlines will go quiet. But it starts from gender socialization, I would say. And so that's at the root of a lot of our social justice themed community outreach and community education is unpacking the gender box, right? Because that gets the more, those are the richest conversations we have that come from the audience, from us.
Yeah, and it's to attain that goal of freedom, is to let people feel like they are being themselves.
Yeah, and I think it also helps, again, getting back to that, making people hopefully feel more comfortable reaching out, that they've experienced trauma. The reality is any human being with a body can be physically or sexually harmed, right? But in our culture, there are particular crimes and sort of gender-based forms of trauma that have been so stigmatized that they keep this vast network of silence going, right? Where the victim of whatever gender maybe feels that it doesn't feel possible to reach out and ask for help. So that's one place. But again, every single human can be an ally. Every single person can notice that somebody else is maybe at risk or in trouble and could maybe use a little bit of help, or just a good-hearted question. Hey, are you okay? Like anything like that can have such a life-changing impact. And that's what we're after. That's our goal.
Yeah, that you're really, taking the origin of this organization and, blowing it up to be so much bigger than just these individual cases.
Yeah. The other thing that I so appreciate, and I'll just put a snapshot sort of this out there, but there was recently a rally supporting BUHS survivors speaking out about some historic treatment. And I won't get super far into that particular situation right here, but at that rally, there were parents with some of their kids, teens, that were there. And at the end of this sort of free sharing at this rally, a 14-year-old spoke up. And basically, this young 14-year-old nailed 50 years of activism, right? And I can't even tell you, my heart just, was so just gladdened by that, right? It's like, this is the aim of the work. We now have this 14-year-old human that finds it inexplicable that we still have some of these archaic behaviors happening, that there could be sexual harassment or sexual harm or physical harm, and can't even do it justice. But I think every adult in that circle felt like wow, it was quite impressive. And that too is, part of the legacy of the activism that we're so grateful for. Didn't start with us. It will not end with us, but it someday will end.
Yeah. That's the goal, certainly.
Right, absolutely.
So yeah, you've spoken about this a little bit, but I'm curious as to some of the other services, outreach, things like that you folks offer, sort of apart from crisis management. You mentioned a couple of workshops and support groups.
Yeah.
You mentioned this rally. I'm curious if you do other like public facing things. Sort of what all that looks like. Yeah,
absolutely. So for individual survivors, we do advocacy. So beyond sort of the crisis intervention part of it, and then the shelters that we talked about, we do advocacy in all the systems that a survivor might encounter. So that could be with law enforcement, if that's helpful, within the court system. One example is that because we serve Windham and Southern Windsor counties, that's 3 hospitals in our catchment area, and we're automatically part of the protocol so that anytime there's been a sexual assault or a rape and somebody comes to the ER for a wellness check or evidence recovery, an advocate is automatically called no matter what hour of the day, and we will be available within very brief time to those emergency rooms. So that's part of the wider advocacy. We have several full-time housing advocates that can help folks really try to put together sort of the it's already a steep climb, I'd say, in our state to find affordable housing for anybody. Not to mention if you have been traumatized enough that you've had to flee a situation or have not, in air quotes here, been allowed to work for a while, so you don't have an income or your rental history has been trashed because an abusive ex has made sure of that, right? Starting over is such a steep uphill climb, and yet, survivors manage to do it. But so we have some housing advocates that can help people access resources and that last month's rent that can be a massive sum to come up with. So we have deep dive advocates to help with some of that. And then we have a full-time youth outreach advocate, because, it's never too early to start having some version of these conversations, right? In terms of empowerment, in terms of healthy relationships, in terms of consent education, really trying to, in terms of unpacking the gender box so we're not inflicting the same kinds of social traumas on every new group of young kiddos, right? So we have that, and then a broad range of options and educational workshops across the lifespan. And so sometimes it's us maybe going in and having, I would say, more conversation than a training, because it's always interactive. We learn too with different, social service organizations that are also seeing survivors. We know we're not seeing the half of it, right? So it may be working with another workplace and training staff there, but we also host things that are community-wide, and it could be film and discussion nights. It could be any range of topics. And this year in particular, because it's our 50th, we're going to have a range of things a little bit later in the year. But for folks that have any questions about how to get involved, give us a call, right? I'm going to just give our office number here. And then Johnny mentioned, our website, or you can follow us on Facebook, but 257-7364 if you want to just chat about ways to get involved or get updates on what we're doing. So it's kind of a wide swath of having these conversations in our community.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it's great that you can focus on just opening up a dialogue. Sometimes I think that can be really important, even for folks who are curious, maybe folks who don't feel comfortable reaching out and feel like a burden, like, they're burdening you with a crisis. But simply having a dialogue is not only a way for them to learn, but for you to learn. And what kind of things do you learn when you open up dialogues like that?
Well, what's been fascinating to me in recent years, because, when I get to do workplace trainings, one of the things that's different about the way the Freedom Center works is we are almost exclusively sitting with and working with the survivor. The rare time that we maybe see their partner or their ex-partner might be if they're in court with each other, but at separate tables. And that's obviously kind of a, formalized, not very natural environment for any of us, right? But so we are almost never interacting and seeing the dynamic between two people. Other folks absolutely are. And so some of the first red or pink flags, if we can call it that, might be becoming apparent to maybe the daycare center, right? Or the whoever, right? Whoever the other service provider is, or the teacher, right? That one of these parents doesn't seem like they're safe to say anything or speak up, or they are always looking nervously over to see if am I allowed to say that. And so we're learning the things that other service providers, right, or healthcare providers are noticing. We have had conversations with folks that medical staff in the emergency room, and sometimes, it's on their radar that somebody was brought in with injuries that are not lining up with the explanation for the injury. And maybe the person who caused the injury is pacing in the waiting room and is their ride, and the person has been threatened. You can go get your bone reset, but if you say one word about how, right? And so other folks that are right at the front lines too are seeing things that don't cross our paths because of the work that we do, right? Or anybody that as part of their work is doing home visiting, right? They maybe are seeing signs in the home or in the whole family constellation that we don't go into the homes of folks. It's typically not safe to come doing domestic violence support work in somebody's home, right? So those conversations, we talk about what are safe ways to get information to the person that we think is at risk, and the home may not be that place. So some of the best, I would say sort of brilliant ideas for engaged bystanders and other professionals, we learn them when we go to these things. So it's very much two-way training because, people's instincts tend to be pretty spot on, and we encourage people to trust them because we've all been around, couples that are okay at least or fairly safe. Then when we start to notice that this is kind of an unusual dynamic here, it's at least doesn't mean there's domestic violence, but it's at least worth paying attention to. And that's too where we let folks know they too, maybe when everybody's left, can hypothetically reach out to the Freedom Center and say, hey, got this family here. And again, it can be all hypothetical. We don't need to know any of it. What are some of the signs? What do you all think? What are some safe ways? And we welcome those conversations because first of all, we're grateful that we know we never could do this work alone, but we're grateful that we never have. There's so many other people don't have to work at the Freedom Center to be an amazing advocate themselves in their own right and an amazing ally, and be a safety pipeline for somebody out in need. So we're grateful for that.
Yeah, it's like having these, on-site dialogues, trainings, whatever you want to call them. Mm-hmm. Seems like it's a two-way street in terms of learning. You're learning what they're seeing, and that might inform, your outreach and how you deal with certain cases. Yeah. And then they're learning how they might navigate those situations.
Absolutely. I would say the added piece to that is when we started, I want to say probably 8 years ago, around that time, we certainly heard about sex trafficking happening. And sometimes people weren't using that terminology, but some version of it was starting to be described. But it was initially some of the healthcare providers that we were already connecting with that were starting to share with us some of the things they were seeing from trafficking survivors. and there's a whole range that we don't have time even right now to talk about. But one of them was, somebody potentially having multiple phones. And even during a medical appointment, they had to answer that phone. They were not allowed to just have time out for, right? And that's, of course, there could be other reasons potentially. But again, we were starting to learn, and it was because these different issues are on people's collective community radar. Again, that's the best safety net any of us can ever have, right? Is that folks are at least willing to pick up the phone without giving names and just, hey, can we have a conversation? We welcome that.
Yeah. And so what is this balance that you're able to kind of strike between crisis management and between like outreach, development, education? I imagine, you're dealing with crises often. Mm-hmm. But what kind of balance are you able to strike?
And I also too, I would say the survivors are the crisis managers. Mm-hmm. They're the ones dealing with the hour by hour, day to day, but we're there as for intervention if they want that. But the direct crisis work, I would say, we deal with it every day. So there's not a day where there aren't crises happening simultaneously, but thankfully there are enough of us that it's kind of we share that load, that we don't look at it as anyone having, quote, a caseload, or that any one of us is the only one working with a survivor. Survivors over a little time will get to know other advocates. We all share the 24-hour hotline coverage. And so the balance can look different every single week. We try to, for instance, since I do community outreach and my coworker Angela does youth outreach, ideally, we would have it be 50-50, but that doesn't often happen, I would say, right? Obviously, crises need to come first. But with that said, we put a lot of time into presentations and are grateful for the invitations to come and talk with folks. And, that's invigorating for us, too, to have these conversations out in the wider community. And so we try to mix it up and be available for both.
Yeah, that's great. That as you should be, absolutely. Mm-hmm. As we're kind of winding down a little bit here, we're about 51 or so minutes in the conversation. Time flies, honestly, when you're so engaged. Yeah. I'd like to get to know about you and your role in the Women's Freedom Center a bit more. So you mentioned you're the sort of an outreach coordinator, and that's what you do with the organization for the most part. How long have you been in the organization? How long have you been in that role?
I've had a couple different roles since I've been there. I've been at the Freedom Center about 15 years. That's not unique at all. I have a coworker that's been there probably twice as long. I've done the work in another state for a bit of time too. But we tend to look at the work as less of a job than sort of a life focus. These issues are very deep in all of us, working to fight for sort of justice and healing. That is, part of the inspiration, I would say. And the community outreach piece, at least 10 years, I would say, that's been part of my role. And what was the other part of that question? How has the organization changed throughout the time that you have been involved with it? I mean, quite a bit. I was grateful to be around for, well, first of all, the name change to the Freedom Center, right? And there was a lot of sort of deep dive organizational soul searching about that. And that was super energizing, right? As somebody who appreciates words and the impact of words, just seeing the approach that the Freedom Center has, that we're not looking to tread water. We want to keep that sort of activist spirit pretty alive and well and changing. So have seen the organization quite a bit. We have grown. We've added new staff members. When I started, there were 2 buildings that we have. We now have 3, and we're looking to open a shelter in the Springfield area early next year, probably. So Great. We've seen quite a bit of growth. All of that is welcome. And I would say, we've also watched some pretty amazing cultural shifts in the time that I've been there. And again, in the interest of time, I'll just sort of the snapshot, the cultural shift of the Me Too movement, right? And the solidarity, global solidarity, I would say, among survivors and allies has been phenomenal to watch. So, even though we still have quite a ways to go, this has been a poignant moment, this 50th year, to really look at, what has half a century already taught us about what survivors are still up against and, what we're all still up against in changing our culture. But what are the strengths and the allyships that we can draw on for the next however many years, right?
Yeah, I think you're at a good point in your history where you can look back and see, how far you've come, and then how that can inform where it goes next.
Absolutely.
What are the next 50 years going to look like?
Let's hope it's not 50.
Yeah.
But
right.
Absolutely. Yeah, spot on.
What is the most maybe the most challenging and the most rewarding parts of what you do?
I would say, and those are such great questions. The most challenging part, I would say, having done this now for a chunk of time, is seeing that for all the progress we're making as humans in our culture, unpacking the gender box, pronouns shifting up. There's a lot that's happening in tandem with different social justice movements that are chipping away at patriarchy and liberating us all. What's most challenging is to hear that, some abusers who are maybe in their teens or 20s or still fairly young are also still sounding like some age-old abusers from great-grandparents' generation, right? So it's the two coexisting. There are such competing narratives in our culture now because of the tension, right? We've made quite a bit of progress. Hooray. And yet, somebody now harming their partner and spouting some of this medieval entitled thinking that they have the right to and all that, whether it's about gender or any other form of entitlement, but certainly we still see the gender piece, right? The sexism and the misogyny. That's, if we compare the Freedom Center and we're not unique at all. There's plenty of organizations also have been turning 50, some of the early grassroots ones. And then patriarchy is how many hundreds, if not thousands of years. We've come quite a way in these really energized 50 years, but we still are sort of schlepping along some of this old ball and chain. So that's the most challenging and, by far, I would say one of the most rewarding parts of our job is that, I can't tell you it's such a rare privilege to hear some of these brilliant healing stories that we hear from survivors. And we welcome hearing that. Some of the inspiration we take literally directly comes from survivors themselves for how to move the movement forward. And, we get to hear just this superpower of healing that humans have. And it's amazing what people can overcome. And that's, it's an honor. It's an honor to be any part of that and to see people coming back and just a completely different spirit to them because they have been able to transform their lives. They've done the work. We just provide some options and resources maybe, but they've done this amazing inner work. And that's, that's a gift. It's a gift to be part of that.
I can imagine that's just really great to see folks like totally turn their lives over to a new leaf. Absolutely.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. I'm remembering just quickly, a couple of years ago, one of the columns, the title, let me see if I can remember this, but it encapsulates this. It was From a Whisper to a Cheer, sort of like a survivor story and 2 hotline calls. And it just so happened that a survivor, the first time they reached out to us on the hotline, had to whisper because they didn't want their kids to hear, and they had to be able to be quiet enough so they could hear the car coming on the gravel driveway, and then they would have to hang up. And so the first hotline call before they could flee was literally a whisper through tears. And then it was, maybe 6 months later, they were able to flee with friends' help and the Freedom Center's help. And then they managed to get their own apartment. And it just so happened the same advocate picked up the next call from that survivor, and she was cheering. And she said, my kids are allowed to laugh again and make noise in the house. They were not allowed before. And it was just that, if anything, kind of telescopes, there's the story right there. And that, yeah, it is a privilege to get to do that kind of work.
Yeah, that is just really a beautiful thing to experience.
Yeah.
I want to sort of wrap up here, and before we do wrap up, I'm curious as to with the sensitive nature of the work that that you are doing, what steps you might take to ensure your own personal safety. There's so many sensitive situations you're working with, and threats of violence, and I'm sure that could be directed toward the Freedom Center for any abuser who might find out about that. So, what steps do folks take to sort of ensure your own safety?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. So, a couple things, and since it's a podcast, maybe it's not as apparent, but we do, part of our role is to, in essence, make noise and have community conversations and draw attention. But we walk that fine line of having to do the crisis work with as much confidentiality and anonymity. And so one of the ways is advocates do not have their last names out in public. And when we are on any sort of televised broadcast or Facebook Live or anything and being interviewed, number one, we welcome the chance to have those conversations, but we're never on camera for anything that's going to be recorded or sort of live on the web. So that's kind of one of the balancing acts is how to have these broader cultural conversations and yet keep some confidentiality for everybody's safety. For the most part, the Freedom Center isn't quite who's at risk. It's the individual survivors, but we definitely have to be mindful of that. So I appreciate that question.
Because they work in tandem.
Totally.
The confidentiality and the safety of the people you're working with and yourselves.
Yeah, absolutely.
You got to create this semblance of a barrier while still, making these personal connections.
Yeah. I mean, well said. That right there. That's so true.
Yeah.
That's so true.
Well, thank you, Shari, for being on my show today. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the chance to talk about this.
Yeah, I feel like I could talk for another hour easy.
Totally appreciate that.
I only got so much time on the radio here. But yeah, thank you for joining this very special episode of Wow and Flutter here, airing on WVEWLP Brattleboro, 107.7 FM. Also airing on Brattleboro Community Television, Comcast channels 1078, 1079. You can also find us at brattleboro.tv. I'm honored to be a part of your 50-year commemoration. I've really enjoyed learning about, sort of the work you do, diving into it both broadly and granularly. I think it's been really informative for me, hopefully for anyone else who's listening too. I do want to remind everyone that they have a website. If you ever want to check it out, there's some cool information on there that you can just learn about. You can learn history, you can learn advocacy, you can, just check it out. It's womensfreedomcenter.net. And also for anyone who might be in crisis, they have some 24-hour hotlines. The Windham County hotline is 802-254-6954. And their Southern Windsor County hotline is 802-885-2050. Thank you for tuning in. Is there anything you want to add before we sign off here?
Oh my gosh, thanks so much for the chance to be here. There are a couple of ways that survivors can get involved in our work and be part of some healing gatherings if they're interested for that, or anybody interested in a bonfire we're having or our gala at the end in October. By all means, just give us a phone call. And that office number again is 802-257-7364. And thank you so much.
Great. And happy Women's History Month, too.
Absolutely. So, thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.